Leading up until the final months of 1923, Adolf Hitler had been getting backed into a corner. His movement had been getting too powerful, and at both the state and national level, the government was growing concerned. The national government had cracked down on right-wing groups hard after the assassination of the Jewish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Walter Rathenau. At the state level, the Conservative government, which held much support among monarchists, was growing annoyed by Hitler's National Socialist movement, which was outshining them on every level. Thousands had joined up with Hitler's new movement, whilst the conservative or monarchist movements of Bavaria fell flat and didn't connect with the working classes or the youth at all. Hitler, meanwhile, had formed a diverse party filled with those from every walk of life, from wealthy industrialists to manual labourers to poets. The Bavarian government began to crack down, and Hitler was left with a choice: to accept their demands, such as being banned from making public meetings, or he could take a stand and make drastic action, even if it was against the law. This video is part of a larger series on Hitler's life, but it can just as easily be viewed as a standalone video. The main playlist is in the description or on my channel homepage if you wish to see it in order, however. A quick disclaimer. Obviously, Adolf Hitler is the most controversial man in history. However, this is simply a video in a series on his life. I will make no opinions of my own, and I'm simply recounting events as they occurred. These views are not my own. And finally, a huge thank you to my patrons who make these videos possible. If you do want to support me and join our Discord or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, please consider signing up using the link in the description for as little as $2 a month. It helps more than you can imagine. Thank you. On the last day of September 1923, Hitler was forwarded a letter from an old member of the party. It was a prediction from a famous astrologer. It said that, quote, "A man of action, born on the 20th of April, 1889, can expose himself to personal danger by excessively uncautious action and very likely trigger off an uncontrollable crisis." Others, such as Wilhelm Wolff, who would go on to be an astrologer for Hitler's SS years later, spoke of an event that would take place on the 8th or 9th of November, and it would be violent with a disastrous outcome. Hitler's response to the first prediction was, quote, "What on earth have women and stars got to do with me?" Most would probably feel the same way if told these things, but whether he liked it or not, Adolf Hitler was being looked at by thousands as the future saviour of Germany, and sooner or later he would have to take drastic action. He even felt this way himself. He was convinced that he was put on this earth to save Germany and that his big moment was approaching. In Germany as a whole, conditions were rife for revolution. The mark was now worth 6 billion marks when compared to that of a single pre-war mark. Hyperinflation had destroyed the country and wiped out everyone but the very wealthy's savings, who were using this crisis to their advantage. Once someone's wages came in, they would have to rush to the bank as the currency was being reduced in value by the second. If you delayed, by the time you tried to cash in your money, it could be worth a quarter of what you expected. Things were a total mess, and it's worth a video of its own. Essentially, hyperinflation was at its craziest. 20 billion mark notes were now in circulation. To put it into perspective, the only people who could understand such a mess were perhaps the American Southerners after the Civil War. Pensioners and workers especially were reduced to a starvation diet and poverty almost overnight. Something in Germany had to change. Vultures pounced on the chaos to make a profit, whilst millions starved. Exchange agents and opportunistic foreigners were among the most obvious. For ridiculously low prices, even a few $100s, wealthy foreigners could simply step in and buy massive estates. By mid-October, 35,000 people had joined Hitler's party this year alone. In the people's minds, he was their only hope. There was no one else, and they loved him for it. All their faith was put in him. Hitler's speeches were more passionate than ever. He spoke of how the German people were in their biggest crisis since the war, and that the people were being looted by opportunistic foreigners. Commissar von Kahr, the man appointed by the Bavarian government and given dictator-like powers to crack down on Hitler, was put in an impossible situation. To act against this man openly, so adored by the people, would have disastrous consequences. Many, even in the Bavarian leadership, were getting cold feet and asking him to go easy on Hitler. The head of the army in Bavaria, Otto von Lossow, was also refusing to crack down on Hitler, and he was dismissed. Many simply could not deny that Hitler may have the solution to the problems, even if they disliked his crude language and violent tactics. As a result, army units all over Bavaria renounced the Weimar government and declared loyalty to only the Bavarian state until things changed. The ship of state had merely listed too far to the left, and it was, and is, Bavaria's duty to right it, a Bavarian cabinet minister admitted. Even von Kahr himself openly defied the Weimar government, publicly saying in a newspaper that they should be overthrown. Von Lossow, the dismissed army general, was stood at the head of his troops days later, and he said there was three options from here. Going on as usual, seceding Bavaria from Germany, or marching on Berlin to proclaim a national dictatorship. The words could have come straight from Hitler himself. Revolution was inevitable, and it was going to come from somewhere, but no one knew exactly when or how. Hitler did not want to separate from the Reich, however, and it appeared as if this was the direction von Kahr and Lossow were heading. Rosenberg and Schwabner-Richter, Hitler's two anti-communist Baltic Germans, who he trusted greatly, came up with a plan. It was daring, but they felt they had no choice to avoid Germany splintering. The plan was to kidnap Prince Ruprecht, who would have inevitably come to power when Bavaria became independent, and also Kahr, both of whom would be at the November 4th Germany Memorial Day ceremony. Hundreds of stormtroopers would seal off the alleyways, and then Hitler would move in and inform these men that he had seized power to prevent a red takeover and separation from Germany. Rosenberg predicted that the coup would be both short and painless. Ernst Hampstegel, a close associate of Hitler's at the time, was horrified by this plan and talked Hitler out of it, saying he needed to stop listening to these crazy Baltic Germans who were going to bring the party to ruin. By now, the Bavarian government resembled the Roman triumvirate of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, but with von Kahr, the commissar, von Lossow, the army general, and von Seisser, the chief of the Bavarian state police. All three mostly agree with Hitler, but all felt his tactics should be either channeled properly or outlawed. An obvious break between Hitler and these three was made on October the 30th when he declared, "The German problem will be solved for me only after the black, white, and red swastika banner floats on the Berlin Palace. We all feel that the hour has come, and like the soldier in the field, we will not shirk our duty as Germans. We will follow the order to keep in step and march forwards." He was desperate for Bavaria to stay within the German nation. In an effort to split the three apart, Hitler approached von Seisser and tried to persuade him to join himself and Ludendorff, but he refused to have anything to do with the World War hero, and neither would his fellow high-ups in the military. The triumvirate began planning to sideline Hitler, and they made plans to unite the other nationalist parties and push for either a national or regional solution together rather than acting independently, like Hitler. They wanted a coup against the Weimar government, just not with Hitler there. Hitler had his own ideas, and in a meeting with his advisors at Schwabner-Richter's apartment, a putsch was planned, which would take place on the 11th of November. The date was chosen as it was the 5th anniversary of Germany's surrender, and as it was a holiday, they would be able to operate more easily, while the police and military were at low strength. They met again the next day, where Göring, Schwabner-Richter, and Ludendorff, although he would later deny it, were present. Final plans were made for the putsch. Major towns and cities would be controlled by seizure of railroad stations, telegraph offices, telephone offices, radio stations, public utilities, town halls, and police headquarters. All communist and socialist leaders were to be arrested, along with heads of trade unions. Hitler would have roughly 4,000 men facing off against 2,600 state police and army troops. It seemed as if it was more likely to succeed than not. Regardless, he had no choice if he wanted to maintain his political position, or he would soon be sidelined if the triumvirate acted first. The same day, another meeting was held, with the ex-police chief and his assistant present, both of whom had been protecting Hitler from the inside. He got them up to speed, and a new step was planned. Von Kahr had suddenly announced he was holding a mass patriot demonstration at the Berger Brokeller the next evening. Outwardly, this was to outline the aims of his regime, but in reality, it was an attempt to beat Hitler to the punch and to swing over all those influential men in attendance to his side for his own coup. Hitler himself was invited by Kahr, but it was an obvious trap. Hitler thought perhaps they would announce Bavaria's independence of Berlin and the restoration of the monarchy whilst he was in attendance, so he couldn't stop it from happening. Hitler planned to turn up and simply imprison all those that he needed to there, like the triumvirate, if they didn't agree to go along with his plan. Besides this, there wasn't much long-term planning, and he simply trusted in fate. Others weren't so sure, but after hours of negotiation, only ending at 3 a.m. on the same day as the coup, November 8th, everyone agreed to follow Hitler. This was officially the new plan. When Hitler awoke on the most important day of his life, he had a headache and a throbbing toothache. The weather was slightly snowy, bitter, and windy. His closest advisers urged him to seek medical attention, but he said this was his fate. He said he, quote, didn't have time and that there was going to be a revolution which would change everything. Late in the morning, the orders were issued to SA leaders by phone, letter, or in person. Things were moving too fast for most, and barely any details were given. Many still thought the original plan for the 11th was in effect still. Just before midday, Hitler burst into Rosenberg's office, beaming with excitement. Swear you will not mention this to a living soul. The hour has come. Tonight we act, he said. Hitler went to see Hermann Esser, the party head of propaganda, and told him to rush up to the podium of the Lowenbrokeller and raise a flag before announcing the National Socialist Revolution. I'm definitely getting these beer hall names wrong. SA men began getting out of their work clothes and putting on their uniforms and their revolvers in their belts. One of the key units, Hitler's 100-man bodyguard, gathered together, and their leader shouted to them, any one of you who isn't going into this heart and soul had better get out right now. He explained that it was their job to bear the brunt of whatever was coming that evening. By the time it was dark, a car pulled up in front of Schwebner Richter's apartment. It was Ludendorff. They talked for a few minutes, then he continued on. Schwebner Richter headed up a few minutes later with his servant at top speed. Hansel, if things don't go right today, we will all be in jail tomorrow, he said to him. Everyone regrouped at party headquarters, along with Hitler, and at almost 8 p.m., they set off for the beer hall in 2 cars. The hall was the second largest in the city and could hold 3,000 people. Police were swarming the place, and they knew there could be trouble, and on that evening, there was 125 of them, as well as men scattered in the audience. At a few minutes past 8, Hitler pulled up, followed by Schwebner Richter's car. The 2 cars pushed through the swarms of people outside, and Hitler then persuaded the police to leave and make room for his troops, who were on their way. Rudolf Hess held the beer hall door open, and in walked Adolf Hitler, for the biggest moment of his life so far. Kahr was mid-speech, and it sounded like he was lecturing the audience, rather than talking to them. Everyone seemed bored, out of their minds. Hitler blended with the crowd, spending 3 billion marks for free beers at the counter. He sipped impatiently as he waited for his men to continue arriving outside, waiting for the opportune moment. Just a few minutes after 8:30, his special bodyguard unit arrived, which was the signal to strike. Armed Nazis surrounded the building, and the bewildered police did absolutely nothing. Hermann Goering and the bodyguard unit rushed through the doors with machine pistols. Hitler shed his coat that was keeping him anonymous, and his personal protector, Graf, rushed to his side. Police rushed to stop the men rushing in, but quickly turned around when demanded to, and simply left the building. Hitler's bodyguards shouted, Heil Hitler, as Hitler pulled out his pistol and moved towards the platform. Men blocked the exits, and another group set up a machine gun facing the audience. Obviously, those in attendance were furious, and tables began flipping, and some took cover. Some rushed for the exits, but they were beaten and forced back. Hitler shot around into the ceiling, and shouted for everyone to be quiet. The National Revolution has broken out. The hall is surrounded, he yelled. He was sweating profusely, and looked ghostly pale. He looked a bit like a joke, but he was dead serious. He demanded the triumvirate into a back room, but they refused, despite his guarantees of safety. Kahr took a step back as Hitler approached, and Seiss's aide reached into his pocket as if to draw a pistol, but Hitler put his gun directly against his head and said, Take your hand out. He did as he was told. Eventually, after a little persuading, the trio followed Hitler into the back room with their 2 aides. Please forgive me for proceeding in this manner, but I had no other means, Hitler explained. Hitler made promises of the trio's future, offering them even more power than they currently had when Hitler seized power and marched on Berlin. Kahr could be regent of Bavaria, Lossow, Reich Army Minister, and Seisser, Reich Police Minister, but they didn't respond. Hitler drew his pistol again and said, There are 5 rounds in it. 4 for the traitors, and if it fails, 1 for me. Hitler seemed confused, as if he had not planned for them to not cooperate, and he left the room, leaving a guard to keep watch on them. The crowd began shouting out, Mexican Revolution, or theatre, mocking Hitler, until Goering put another round to the ceiling to shut them up. You've got your beer. What are you worrying about? He joked. Hitler stepped up to the stage and began talking. What followed then was an oratorical masterpiece, which any actor might envy. He began quietly, without any pathos, said historian Professor von Müller. He spoke as if the trio in the back room were about to come around to Hitler's plan at any second, and assured them that Kahr had his full trust. He said that Ludendorff would be the leader of the army, and announced the other positions of the triumvirate before shouting, The task of the Provisional German National Government is to organise the march on that sinful Babel, Berlin, and save the German people. The professor remembers such a change of the crowd in a few minutes, almost a few seconds. There were certainly many who were not yet converted, but the sense of the majority had fully reversed itself. Hitler had turned them inside out, as one turns a glove inside out, with a few sentences. It had almost something of hocus pocus, or magic about it. Loud approval roared forth. No further opposition was to be heard. Outside are Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser. They are struggling to reach a decision. May I say to them that you will stand behind them? Said Hitler to his now adoring crowd. Ja, 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 they shouted back. In a free Germany, there is also room for an autonomous Bavaria. I can say this to you. Either the German Revolution begins tonight, or we will all be dead by dawn, he said dramatically, before walking off to the back room to talk to the trio again. At that moment, Ludendorff marched into the beer hall and was greeted by a series of heils and cheers from the crowd. He wasn't happy, however. He could see things weren't going well. Ludendorff reluctantly agreed to help convince the triumvirate. All right, gentlemen, come along with us and give me your hand on it. Lossow instantly shook Ludendorff's hand, then the next one, and finally, Kahr, when he was given an assurance of the German monarchy in the future after he acted as regent. The crowd went wild when they heard of the trio's agreement. Hitler was in ecstasy as he watched the cheering crowd. I am going to fulfill the vow I made to myself 5 years ago when I was a blind cripple in a military hospital, to know neither rest nor peace until the November criminals had been overthrown, until on the ruins of the wretched Germany of today there should have arisen once more a Germany of power and greatness, of freedom and splendour. Next, Ludendorff spoke gravely to the crowd like a man who knew this was life or death. The crowd was nearly in tears, and they began singing Deutschland über alle. Many lost their voice, they were so emotional. They felt as if finally Germany could be proud again. Across the river at the Lowenbrokeller, over 2,000 members of the German Battle League and the SA were going wild. Rom was the main attraction, despite his men only being a minority of the audience. He called for revenge and retaliation against the traitors and the despoilers of our people. Rom and Esser were given the signal that Hitler had succeeded with a telephone message saying, "Safely delivered." Rom shouted out the news and announced the National Socialist Revolution to all in attendance. Army soldiers tore off the Weimar Republic cockades from their hats and began shouting with joy on the tables. SA men embraced each other, and the band blared the national anthem. When all had calmed down from their initial celebration, Rom commanded everyone to march on the main beer hall, where Hitler was located. With joyous chants and shouts, the men charged out of their hall towards Hitler's, before they were stopped by a courier on a motorcycle with no orders, to head to the university and occupy General von Lossow's headquarters and arm themselves with a cache of rifles there. Only the band continued onto Hitler's beer hall. As the men set off to their new location, the public cheered at them and whipped out their hidden imperial flags and flew them proudly. Near the head of the marching column was a man also proudly holding an imperial German flag. His name was Heinrich Himmler. They reached their location, and without much persuading, the location was handed over to them. Back at the beer hall, Rudolf Hess was rounding up so-called enemies of the people as hostages. One by one, their names were called, such as Prince Ruprecht's political advisor, and they stepped up like meek schoolboys, doing as they were told. They were moved to a house south of Munich for safekeeping. Other members of the party were out on the streets to check to see how the average person was taking the revolution. It was confusing, to say the least. Many were overjoyed, some simply confused, and some furious. Almost none of them fully understood what was going on. The police didn't react. Party members within the force were keeping them calm and answering the frantic telephone calls from lower-ranking officers, telling them to wait and do nothing. All seemed well, and Hitler was so happy it was as if he was on another planet. Then news came that things weren't going so well at the engineer barracks. The revolutionaries were arguing with the engineers. Perhaps Hitler's euphoria had got the better of him. He immediately set off to go settle the issue in person, a mistake he would gravely regret. He left Ludendorff in charge, an even bigger mistake. As soon as Hitler left the building, General von Lossow of the Triumvirate said he had to go to his office and issue orders. To Ludendorff, this sounded fine for some reason, and he simply let not only Lossow leave, but the other two also. Hitler was turned away at the engineer barracks gate and returned to be absolutely horrified by what Ludendorff had done. Hitler went berserk at him, but he simply looked back at Hitler and said, "A German officer would never break an oath." A very naive thing to say during a putsch. At 11 p.m, Hitler felt like he was back on top when a 1,000-man military unit arrived, mostly comprised of an elite group of cadets who had been persuaded to join the putsch by a Freikorps lieutenant, Gerhard Rossbach. They placed their own commander under arrest and accepted Rosbach as their new leader. Ludendorff and Hitler reviewed them before sending them off to occupy the offices of von Kahr, whilst the Putsch leaders set off for military district headquarters. Then, everything began to go wrong. No one could get a hold of any of the triumvirate on the phone, and the stubborn Ludendorff simply kept dismissing everyone's concerns by again saying that German officers do not break oaths. Everyone else understood fully. Something was wrong. Lossow called his men, who were literally in the next room to Rom. From the safety of the 19th Bavarian Infantry Barracks, Lossow arranged a counterattack against the revolutionaries. Loyal army battalions from all the surrounding cities were to be transported to Munich by rail, and everything was put in place. Von Lossow called half of the battalions himself to make sure they listened. Only after all these calls were made, just before midnight, did Rom's men think to limit the switchboard traffic to prevent this. Schwebner Richter set off with his servant to locate Seisser, but couldn't find him. When they returned, they found Hitler, quote, somewhat depressed. At a local printing shop, Rosenberg was busy printing off copies of the announcement of the new government. The announcement requested the handover, dead or alive, of President Ebert and other leading Social Democrats of the actual national government to the new People's National Government. Meanwhile, Rom finally became suspicious and arrested the man in the next room who had sabotaged his plans, mostly due to Rom's own incompetence. Von Kahr was busy working with Prince Ruprecht to crush the putsch at all costs. In the prince's words, use troops if necessary. It was clearly all coming to an end. Von Kahr helped the defense of his building against the 1,000 new cadets who had joined Hitler's cause. A standoff ensued with police and cadets facing each other at bayonet point in a kind of standoff. No one wanted to kill other men in uniform, and the cadets eventually withdrew. Von Kahr finally left and met up with the other members of the triumvirate, where he made his proclamation to be posted around the city. He said that deception had turned a demonstration for Germany's awakening into sickening violence. Quote, had the senseless and purposeless attempt at revolt succeeded, Germany would have been plunged into the abyss and Bavaria with it, he said. He then officially dissolved the NSDAP and other right-wing parties involved, and claimed that those responsible for this putsch would be ruthlessly made to suffer the punishment they deserved. It was not until 5 a.m. that the news reached Hitler was confirmed that the triumvirate had not stuck to their word, although everyone knew this deep down already. Von Lossow was dedicated to putting down the putsch with force. Hitler showed no negative emotion and made a speech to his fellow conspirators, ending with the statement that he was willing to fight and die for this cause. Ludendorff agreed with these sentiments, and they set back off to the Beer Hall, leaving Rom in charge of the military building they were holding. On the way, Hitler said, if we get through, very well. If not, we'll have to hang ourselves. All those men involved that were not holding strong points were informed that they must assemble at the beer hall. Despite the feeling among most that something was wrong, they pushed on regardless, and the SA men pushed through the empty streets, flying flags and singing. At the beer hall, the excitement of last night had evaporated, and a sense of foreboding fell upon those stood around. The leaders were upstairs in a private room, and Ludendorff's stony-faced calmness evaporated when given the news that Lossow had publicly denounced the new government. I will never again trust the word of a German officer, he shouted before retreating into silence. More revolutionaries began turning up from outside districts, the largest being from Landshut, and they were in high spirits, unlike those who had seen events so far. Men like Göring and Streicher tried to raise everyone's spirits in the beer hall. We're going to try the whole thing over again, said Göring, as he blamed the failure so far on the trio's inability to keep their word. Outside the hall, confusion reigned all over Munich. In some areas, police were arresting the rebels, but in other parts, the rebels were arresting the police. No one knew the full story of what was going on, not even Hitler. It was chaos. The leaders of the putsch were in dispute, and clearly there was no contingency plan, if there had even been a plan if things had gone well. One of Ludendorff's staff suggested they withdraw to Rosenheim, a town on the Austrian border, where they could win over the right-wing radicals there and regroup. Göring, who was born and raised in Rosenheim, agreed. He assured everyone that the area was strongly pro-Hitler. Ludendorff replied that the movement cannot end in the ditch of some obscure country lane. The decision was left with Hitler. He was a born gambler, so he chose one last throw of the dice. On the streets, the situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Rom was under siege by army and state police at the military district HQ. The situation here gave the leaders the push they needed. They had to act now. Rom and his men were ready to fight till the end, and if something didn't change, they would end up fighting and dying. Ludendorff claims that marching to rescue Rom was his idea. Regardless, off they went. The men marched on in propaganda parade style, an act designed to arouse support from the citizens. We'd go to the city to win the people to our side, to see how publicly opinion would react, and then to see how Kahr, Lossow, and Seisser would react to public opinion. After all, those gentlemen would hardly be foolish enough to use machine guns against the general uprising of the people. That's how the march into the city was decided on, claimed Hitler when made to testify later. Ludendorff assured everyone that army troops wouldn't stop the march. The heavens will fall before the Bavarian Reichswehr turns against me. Others, including Hitler, were just as confident. Surely no one would fire on a hero of Germany like Ludendorff. They set off. In the lead, a few skirmishers and 8 men carrying swastikas in a van. Behind them, the leaders, Hitler with Schwebner Richter on his right and Ludendorff on his left. Hitler's personal bodyguard, Graf, as well as Hermann Goering, were right there in the front too, Goering's Pour le Mérite award proudly displayed on his shirt. Behind them followed 3 units. On Hitler's left was his 100-man bodyguard unit. Behind, a collection of men of all kinds, some in World War uniforms, some in work clothes or suits. The cadets were there amongst the shopkeepers, middle-aged businessmen, and whoever else decided to come along to support the man they believed in so strongly, no matter the odds. Schwebner Richter grabbed his fellow Baltic German best friend, Rosenberg's, hand and said, "Things look ugly," and then turned to Hitler and said it would be their last walk together. Hitler himself looked pale and scared. After a short while, the 2,000 men reached a bridge and were stopped by police, who loaded live ammunition and stood ready to fire. But they were quickly overrun by the rebels, who screamed at them, "Don't shoot at your comrades." The police hesitated, and the moment was lost, as they got swamped and the march pushed on. As they pushed onwards, many more random civilians joined the parade, and crowds cheered them on. The love from the Muncheners inspired the marchers to start singing. As the marchers reached the city hall, where the Nazi flag was still flying, there was confusion about what to do next. Some thought they would go back to the beer hall, others that they would march on and save Rom. Ludendorff took the lead and made everyone take a right turn. This turn took Hitler's crowd face to face with the government forces. City police blocked the way, but the men kept pushing forward, singing "O Germany, high in honour." The tight street only allowed for 8 people to fit side by side, and Hitler locked arms with Schwebner Richter in preparation for trouble. Ludendorff, however, looked supremely confident that no one would fire upon him. Lieutenant von Godin, the leader of the police, called out, "Second company, double time, march," and the police jogged forwards. The march did not break, however, and pushed forwards with their bayonets out and pistols at the ready. A clash suddenly broke out between the police and the marchers, and then a shot rang out. The police had opened fire, and then the rebels immediately returned it, but they were at a disadvantage. One of the first to get hit was Schwebner Richter, as a shot tore through his lungs just inches away from Hitler. Another bullet was coming right at Hitler himself, as the police were deliberately aiming for him, but Graf, his bodyguard, literally leaped in front of him to take it. He then dragged Hitler to the ground, so hard that he dislocated Hitler's arm. He took another half-dozen bullets on the ground as he covered Hitler, but somehow he lived. Schwebner Richter helped drag Hitler to the pavement before dropping dead. A man stepped over his body. It was Ludendorff, who simply walked into the firing line, knowing no one would shoot the famous war hero. Many accounts of the day deny this, though, and claim that Ludendorff hit the deck just like most others. Ludendorff did have a knack, and also a motive, to lie after the event, to distance himself from it. So take that how you will. As Hitler laid there on the ground in agony, thinking he had been shot, but in reality it was his shoulder, he was covered by comrades trying to shield him. On the street, 14 of his men lay dead, and he would never forget their sacrifice, constantly honouring them when he later came to power. 4 police were also killed, and ultimately, almost everyone there, on both sides, was sympathetic to Hitler, and the police were just doing what they were told. Everyone in the rear scrambled as they heard shots again, and rumours flew around suggesting Hitler and Ludendorff had both died. Ludendorff, who had supposedly crossed over to the police through the fire, or however he got there, was taken into custody, but behaved like a spoilt child to them, refusing their polite offers to tell his family he was safe, and forbid them to call him His Excellency, and he insisted on being called Mr. Ludendorff. Hitler struggled away from the scene, accompanied by Dr. Walter Schultz, chief of the Munich SA Medical Corps. He walked past a small boy who was bleeding profusely and begged Schultz to let him help, but the doctor's cousin took him instead. They got to Hitler's car, which was full of medical supplies, and the injured young boy was pulled into with Schuster, the cousin. They headed for the beer hall to find out what was happening, but they came under machine gun fire and changed route. The boy regained consciousness, so he was let out and headed home with the help of Schuster. They tried another route, but were shot at by machine guns again. There was no choice, with all the guns and the bridges blocked, so they headed south towards Salzburg. Back at the scene of the shooting, Goering's display of his prestigious war medal had not saved him, and he was shot in the thigh. He was taken away and escaped to safety by the kindness of a lady named Mrs. Borland, the wife of a Jewish merchant who had appeared on the scene to help the wounded. He could not bear the thought of prison, so he too headed south. Hess had managed to get a hold of his fiancée, Ilse Prowl, and she cycled over 30 miles to get him. And on the trip back, they would alternate who walked and who cycled. It was quite a process. He took shelter at one of his closest friends' houses, the Haushoffers. He talked of suicide, but decided against it. He was completely depressed though, but ultimately he had gotten away and was safe for now. Many had the same idea. Whilst hundreds were arrested and disarmed on the street, many fled and avoided prison. Germany was a mess of loyalties, and it wasn't as simple as just arresting everyone and throwing away the key, like a similar event would have nowadays. The men holding the beer hall gave up without a fight, and Rom also gave up resisting. The police, everywhere they went, were met with chants from civilians such as Jew defenders, betrayers of the fatherland, Hail Hitler, down with Kahr, and the like. At 4 p.m, Hitler arrived at the country villa of Ernst Hampstegel, where his wife let them in. Hitler began shouting in rage, lamenting the death of Ludendorff and Graf, both of whom he saw drop and assumed dead. Ludendorff's trustfulness had cost them the day, and Graf's faithfulness had robbed him of the most loyal man he knew. In reality, they were both alive. Hitler condemned the treachery of the triumvirate and vowed to go on fighting for his ideals as long as breath was in him. Hitler was taken upstairs in pain with his injured arm, and Helen, Ernst's wife, could hear Hitler's groans of pain from downstairs, but he managed to get some rest. The next morning, he sent his doctor into town to get a better car so that he could be driven across the Austrian border. In the afternoon, however, any plans Hitler had to escape were dashed. A nearby villa called the Hampstegel family telephone and informed them that their home was being raided by the police and that they were next. Mrs. Hampstegel went upstairs to tell Hitler the news, and he did not take it well. He went into hysterics and shouted, "Now all is lost, no use going on," and pulled out his revolver. Luckily for Hitler, she snatched the revolver from his hand. He didn't resist. Think of all your followers who believe in you, and who will lose all faith if you desert them now. How can you leave all the people you've gotten interested in your idea of saving your country and then take your own life, she said. She then went off to hide the gun inside of a bin full of flour she had been hoarding, and then headed back to talk with the dejected Hitler. She set Hitler straight and told him to write out instructions for the party members while he was away, and he immediately got to work. The most important one was to Rosenberg, telling him to keep watch over the party newspaper and to lead the movement from now on. Helen Hampstegel hid the instructions with the gun in the flour bin. A few moments later, the police arrived. They apologized to her and asked to search the premises. She then led them upstairs, where to their surprise, they found Adolf Hitler sat there in his pajamas and bathrobe. Once everyone was in the room, Hitler began a tirade against the government and its officials, before cutting himself off and telling them to hurry up and get on with it. He put his trench coat over his bathrobes and was allowed to attach his iron cross before being led outside. "What are you bad men doing to my Uncle Dolph?" shouted Egon, the family's 3-year-old son, as the police led him away. Hitler gently patted him on the cheek and continued on. Hitler looked depressed on the long drive across the winding roads towards Landsberg prison, his new home. The only time he spoke was to ask about the fate of Ludendorff. It turned out he was now free. After assuring the authorities he was simply an innocent bystander. He was taken to a huge cell, the only one big enough for a military guard. Its previous occupant, the assassin of Kurt Eisner, the communist revolutionary, was changed to another cell. Almost immediately after Hitler's imprisonment, he was being talked of in the past tense. It was assumed his political career was done, which made sense given he was sat in a jail cell. Author Arthur Moller van der Broek said, "There are many things that can be said against Hitler, but one thing one will always be able to say: he was a fanatic for Germany." Hitler was wrecked by his proletarian primitivism. He did not understand how to give his National Socialism any intellectual basis. He was passion incarnate, but entirely without measure or sense of proportion. Back in Munich, however, his most loyal men retained hope and faith in the Führer. An order was being issued underground to the local Nazis. It read, "The first period of the National Revolution is over. It had brought the desired cleansing of the air. Our highly revered Führer, Adolf Hitler, has again bled for the German people. The most shameful treachery that the world has ever seen has victimized him and the German people. Through Hitler's blood and the steel directed against our comrades in Munich by the hands of traitors, the patriotic battle leagues are welded together for better or worse. The second phase of the National Revolution begins." A lot can be said about the National Socialists, but they were certainly persistent. Most men would wither and die by now after such a catastrophe, but Adolf Hitler was not most men, and as we know in hindsight, the story does not end here. Thank you very much for watching. I post a new episode of this series on Adolf Hitler's life every weekend. If you did enjoy, please leave a like, and make sure to turn notifications on so you know when I next upload. An especially big thanks to my patrons who make it possible for me to do this. If you want to support me for as little as $2 a month, as well as to join our Discord or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 game, please consider clicking the link in the description. Thank you to Lobster TU, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsog, Anton Bergland, Levi E, Lanza, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, and Henry Unruh.